Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of your meeting and allowing me to give a short report on a number of issues that are happening in the Holy Land, Palestine and Israel. And in addition, I would like to thank you all for your commitment and your involvement into organizations, movements, actions, activities that are related to Palestine, Israel, and the cause of justice. We appreciate this. We know in many ways that you could really live your life avoiding being part of this whole mess, but you chose to be part, a positive part, in hopefully helping us find a solution to our existing conflict. So thank you individually and as an organization. I have prepared a very general, because of time limitation and because there's so many topics that we can discuss, a very brief introduction. But it's not very brief, so don't get surprised that there's plenty of slides. But for you, we're going to have a space for questions and answers. Please, if you would like me to elaborate or to go deeper into a topic, please do leave this into the questions and answers. So the church scene in Palestine and Israel, you know, it's very problematic terminology is very problematic when it comes to Palestine and Israel. So a part of this section, this is the occupied Golan Heights. This is historical Palestine. So it really depends what is Palestine, what is Israel, really depends on whom you're talking to and their perspective of the Holy Land. So many Palestinians would say the whole Holy Land is historical Palestine or is Palestine today. Many Israelis would say the whole country is Israel. Some people would also offer different solutions or options regarding borders when it comes to Palestine and Israel. When we use the terminology of Palestine and Israel, Israel is the green part, which was established after Nakba 1948. And this is in accordance with international law, keeping in mind that Israel is one of the countries or few countries, if not the only country, that does not recognize or state where their borders are. So it makes it very difficult and challenging when they come and they speak about, we need to defend our borders. What borders are you talking about? So they keep this as pretty vague. The only person who mentioned who made a statement on the borders of Israel was one of the past Israeli prime ministers. And she said, wherever the last boot of our soldiers stand is the borders of Israel. Her name is Golda Meir. What is orange or brown? This is what was occupied in 1967, and by international law, this includes also East Jerusalem, and this would be Palestine. So this is the Gaza Strip, and this is the West Bank. This is as Sabeel or as myself also. I use the terminology that is within the international community. So when we speak about the churches, Christianity in the Holy Land, this is for the people who have visited the Holy Land or Jerusalem. This is called the Cross of Jerusalem. And really there isn't a single definition of it. Some people call it as this is the cross of Jesus, and the news of the resurrection went into the four corners of the world. Others would say this is the fifth crusade. There were 4 crusades earlier, and the fifth, which would be seen as the Franciscans returning to the land or coming to the land, as the fifth. Others see that this is the cross of Jesus, and these are the 4 Gospels: Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. So it depends on whom you're speaking to. For us, or at least me personally, I see this as representing Christianity. And in Christianity, there's plenty of denominations, but there's 4 major denominations or Christian families. One is the Orthodox, mainstream Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox. And this is the family I belong to. There is also the Oriental Orthodox. They represent churches of the East, like the Copts, Ethiopians, Armenians, Syrian Church, Chaldean Church. There is also the Catholic family, and there's plenty of, it is all of the different denominations that see the Pope in Rome as their supreme or their highest authority. And then there is the Protestant churches, and they cover all kinds of Protestants: high church, low church, free church, evangelicals, Pentecostals, Anglicans, Lutherans. And in Christianity, in the Holy Land, we have all, everybody is represented in the Holy Land. Part of it is because churches always wanted, whether they are international or local, they wanted to maintain a Christian presence in the Holy Land, in Jerusalem and Bethlehem. When people visit Jerusalem, they would like to see that their church or their own denomination has a headquarter or multiple churches. Just in a way to, it's the fight over Jerusalem, unfortunately, through the divisions of our Christian history. However, there are 13 different churches that are recognized by the government. Now, I know it doesn't make sense when we speak recognized by the government, but from the Ottoman times or throughout our history, because of the diverse religious presence in Palestine, historical Palestine, it was very difficult to create a single law, a civil law. So Muslims would adhere to Muslim law, Christians, depending on their denomination, will adhere to Christian laws. It means getting married, divorce, inheritance, and so on. And Jews would also do the same, and also the Samaritan small community. So because of this, each church has much power over the constituency that they represent. So it's not only that it is, I belong to a certain church. By law, I have to belong to a certain church, to a certain faith, and to a certain denomination. And respectfully, I would also have to follow the rules and the regulations they have. So in Palestine, you cannot get married, or in Israel, or maybe in most of the Middle East, you cannot get married in a civil court. You need to go to church, and this is, or to the mosque or to the synagogue, and then your marriage certificate is developed. So the church plays a much bigger role, or the religious community plays a much bigger role than any part of the world, or than most parts of the world. And in Palestine, we have 13 different churches that have been recognized by the Ottomans. And during the British Mandate, they just recognized whoever the Ottomans recognized. And later on, when Israel came in and the Palestinian Authority, they just recognized these 13 different churches. Now, out of the 13 different churches, only 2 church leaders are Palestinians, and they are elected by their community. 11, and these are the Anglican Church, and this is the new bishop, Bishop Hassam, and this is the Lutheran bishop, who is also has been only in position in the past 2 years, Bishop Ibrahim Azar, Sani Azar. And they represent a very small percentage of the Christian community in both Palestine and Israel. The Lutheran Church only has presence from only in the center and southern part of the West Bank, no presence in Israel at all. The Anglican Church only has presence within Jerusalem and to the north of the country, including West Bank and Israel. This has its own history. But they represent a small community of the believers, of Christians, of the indigenous Christians of the Holy Land. And the majority, we fall under the leadership of 11 different church leaders, who most of them, if not all of them, do not speak even Arabic. It's not only the bishops and the patriarchs are foreigners, but actually a big percentage of their clergy, their monks. And usually there is a very big separation between the local indigenous community and the church leadership. So the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church have Greek and Italian leadership. And this means that the decision-making happens on their side with almost zero coordination or even consultation with the local community. So when people come and say, why is the church not really making a very big prophetic voice for Palestinians or for or addressing the occupation and the human rights violation in Palestine and Israel, a big part of it is that the leadership does not feel the same, does not go through the same experiences of their indigenous communities. And sometimes they feel there's a struggle happening in most of the churches where the local community, which is normal, they would like to have a representation of the people who represent them to be elected by them, or or are able to understand their culture, their concerns, the context, speak the same language. And there's always somehow like a power struggle in most of the churches, if not all of them. And also in defending, or to clarify the position of the churches, they are very fragile structures that have to operate in both Palestine and Israel, and sometimes Jordan, and sometimes other countries in the Middle East, while their main offices are in Jerusalem. So they need to really speak with every government. So they need to go into negotiations with with different governments. So in a way, they need to try to maintain a relationship. So in a way, just to ensure, because they are foreigners, they need to make sure that they are still granted visas to remain in the country. And this is why every now and then, unfortunately, we hear about the church sells the land, a piece of land, to an Israeli settler organization. So some people who are not very much aware about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, they would say, oh, why do you object if a church sells the land? In Australia, they sell land. In the US, they sell land and property. We're concerned for two reasons. Because most of the land that gets sold, or if not all of it, are in locations that are very important for our Palestinian struggle. So it is important locations in Jerusalem, in the Old City, that really affect the livelihood of many Palestinians. Another part of it is that they're selling it to illegal Israeli organizations, settler organizations, that by international law, they're not supposed, although Israel, in a way, you can justify why they are occupying Palestine, if you want to take this route. But Israel should not move its populations into Palestinian occupied territories. However, the church is seen as complicit with this. The third part is that it's not like they go and they announce, we're having a financial problem, who would like to buy this land, opening this for richer churches, local businesses, or it's like in an open tender. These deals are usually done behind closed doors, without really saying where the money is going, how the money, without clear transparency. In most of these cases, if not all of them. So this is why it adds to the friction and the frustration that is felt between the church leadership and the local communities. And this is continuing and contributing to the expansion of this gap. Many of our local community don't feel that they understand the church, and the church feels that they are very much not relevant to the local community and distant. So when we speak about Christians inside Israel, only to remind you, we're talking about Christians inside Israel according to international law. Today is actually maybe a maximum, if maybe this number is also not accurate, 51% or 50%, or even maybe less than 50% of the Palestinian citizens of Israel who are Christian are indigenous. The Christian community is much bigger. So there's a small community of Messianic Jews, and many evangelical churches get excited when Jews convert to Christianity or accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior for many reasons. So this is why it gets much attention internationally with trying to fund these organizations or these growing or small communities, supporting them, and so on, which is, it's by its own a big theological discussion that we need to address. 23% of the Christians inside Israel are Russians and Ethiopians who came into the country as if they were Jews. Ethiopia, a country in Africa, has many financial problems. The Russians started their Russian Jews or Russians who immigrated into Israel They came towards the end of the Soviet Union or just after the collapse. The financial situation was very difficult. They were able to get or forge documents that they were Christian, that they were Jews, and they moved into the country. And after they were granted citizenship, they became practicing Christians. Their numbers are, it's very difficult to know the exact number. So an estimate says that there are 100,000 who are, or that's around 100,000 of those communities, or we know for fact because when you're asked to place your faith or your religion into your passport or your identification card in Israel, like it is in the PA, they've stated we are Christians. They say there's another 50% of them at least who are practicing Christians, but they have on the documentation either no religion or Jews, because they're just too lazy to do it. They're not courageous to do it. They're afraid because of they're trying to apply for other relatives to come into the country and so on. 20% of the expatriate, 20% of our Christian community inside Israel are expatriates. Many of them are within the healthcare system. Israel has a shortage of nurses, and many of so they recruit people, nurses from the Philippines, people who would come and support sick people or to do certain jobs at elderly homes or at hospitals or clinics. And most of them they recruit in the Philippines, and most of the people in the Philippines are Christians, Catholics. And some of them, they get married here, they have children, and so on. So many of the expatriates have, or the descendants of expatriates, they have their own legal situation. This needs a whole session by itself. But they're around 20% of the population. And 3% are others, are people, are spouses of Jews. Somebody goes to Australia, an Israeli for tourism, falls in love with an Australian Christian, comes back, and she would like to join a church or so on. So there are small, and that's just an example, but there's plenty of these categories. Each group has their own challenges. There used to be before COVID-19 a big community of Christian refugees, mainly from Africa, who came into Israel illegally, and most of them were Christian, or a big percentage of them were Christian. But during COVID-19, when nobody was watching, Israel just deported most of them. So I think there are less than 1,000 who have remained in the country as of today, while they were close to, at a certain time, close to 40,000. So they were deported under the justification of COVID-19 and other restrictions. Christians inside the West Bank and Gaza. Now, unlike the situation in Israel, most of the Christians who are in the West Bank and Gaza are indigenous. Very small percentages who are not indigenous. They're even less than 0.5%. And mainly they are either expatriates or they are spouses of Muslims who are living in the country. So most of the Christian community are in the Bethlehem area, in the Christian triangle, as some people might know it, Bethlehem, Beit Jala, Beit Sahur. In Jerusalem, 13% of the Christian community, which is East Jerusalem, is part of the West Bank, and this is why I included it here as part of the West Bank and Gaza. The remaining parts of the West Bank, a part of Jerusalem and Bethlehem, which is to the north of Jerusalem, mainly Ramallah is a big percentage where Christians live, but also in many smaller villages around the West Bank, around 24%. There is less than 2% of our Christian community that still lives in Gaza. Their numbers are close to 1,000 today. So these percentages are not from the Palestinian population, but actually from the whole Christian community. So in general, Christians, indigenous Christians, or Christians in general, are around 400 or 450,000 in Palestine and Israel. Half of them are indigenous, at least, and the other half are not indigenous. 70% of the Christians who are the Christians live inside Israel, and 25% and and the remaining 25%, which is like around 50,000, live in the West Bank and Gaza. So regarding the political situation, I mean, it's pretty sad. Again, the last elections that we had in Palestine and Israel, in Palestine, it was in 2006 where there was the big division between, which followed by a big division between our two main political factions, Fatah and Hamas. And this has created a deadlock between our community. Although that we're still under occupation, we are also suffering from from a division, and we're living under two governments in a way. People who live in Gaza are under the leadership of Hamas, and the people who live in the PA in the West Bank live under the authority of the Palestinian government, the Fatah government. Now, what people need to know is that there's two major, and we were supposed to have last year elections, but they got cancelled for a number of excuses. Some of it might be genuine, some of it is just be just nobody wants to go to have a democratic election. So Hamas, basically, they believe that it is, or historically, and now there's different voices within Hamas, but historically they believe that the whole country of historical Palestine should be ours, and we should liberate it through the military struggle. And this is why every now and then there is a violent escalation in Gaza, and Hamas fires rockets or uses other violent actions. When it comes to Fatah, although Fatah and the PLO originally adopted violent means, they have moved more into non-violent means and basically focusing on international law as the main way to fight the Israeli occupation and to help them and to exert pressure using the help of the international community to challenge Israeli policies in the West Bank and Gaza. The PA is not very popular because you can see that Israel seems to be immune to, and there's an impunity for Israel whenever it is they break international law. Nobody's really holding them accountable. We hear a statement here and a statement there, or it is a documentary that comes out, but honestly it doesn't really do much. It is the BDS movement is helping to exert some pressure from local and from common people and some of the organizations and unions, but still needs to be more effective so that Israel feels the pressure. So this political situation in Palestine is very complicated and very sad. When it comes to Israel, the situation is very complicated. In Israel, there's two political parties, which they used to be one political party, which are not here seen as the joint list, which is more secular Arab. 15% of the, or close to 20% now, of the population inside of Israeli citizens are Palestinians who hold the Israeli identity, passport, citizenship. In 1948, Israel expelled and has caused close to 1 million, from 800,000 to 1 million Palestinian refugees to leave what became the state of Israel and became the biggest community of Palestinian refugees in the world. 20% who have remained as of today. Half of them are divided between two political parties or two political blocs. One bloc is the secular parties, which are around, they have 6 seats in the parliament. And Ram they have 4 seats, which are the Muslim affiliated political parties. So these 50% of our community inside Israel refuse to take part of the elections. They just don't believe that the Knesset is, or Israel is a democratic state, and they believe that this is only just Israeli elections, and asking Palestinians to be members of parliament is just to justify or for Israel to say that they are a political, the only democracy in the Middle East. And they have a point. They have a very strong point, because there are over 64 laws, constitutional laws inside Israel, basic laws that discriminate against non-Jews. The most famous is that recognizing Israel is a country for the Jewish people. So this is like, it makes it almost impossible for Palestinians, citizens of Israel, to obtain equal rights. However, the rest of the Knesset members who have been elected recently, they are all Zionist, and when it means Zionist, that it means that they are for the they are for the establishment, obviously, of a Jewish state and maintaining the Jewishness of the state in the Holy Land, or in Israel. 80% of them do not believe, or over 80% of them do not believe in the two-state solution. They think either they need to kick the rest of us out if they are very extreme, or they need to just to maintain a tight grip over Palestinians, not only Palestinian citizens of Israel, but also Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza. All of them do not believe in splitting Jerusalem, apart a very small political party. So it's honestly, there's no partners for peace, or there's no people inside the Israeli Knesset, the majority, not no people, but the wide majority, the vast majority, are not partners of peace based on international law and human rights. So we are in a deadlock. There's no partners. You cannot speak with the Palestinians, who have two governments, and it's complicated. And in Israel, even if you wanted to speak with, start a peace process, there's no basis for a solution. When people need to sit and talk with each other, they need to agree on a basic principles. There's no basic or mutual language. So Sheikh Jarrah, Sheikh Jarrah was in the news very much during May. When I started working at Sabeel and we were leading groups into Sheikh Jarrah, there were 89 families that were facing forced displacement, or threats of being displaced or being evicted from their homes, that they've been living in them for decades, even before before the occupation of East Jerusalem. Today, the 89 homes have turned only into 47 homes, which is very scary, because almost half have already been taken over by Israeli settlers. So since May, 4 families have been evicted, but Israel usually uses 2 tactics. One tactic is evict one by one. It's very timely and consuming, and it's annoying because it takes so much time to get rid of the people. Or they use what they attempted to do in May, is just say everybody's out, but this attracts more international media attention. So the situation remains sad. Eventually, I think they will all be evicted. They're just trying to stay for longer. Israel is trying to make certain deals with some of the families. Like, okay, you just recognize that it is your houses belong to Jewish settler organizations, and you'll have to pay like a very small rent, like $5 a month. And we can guarantee that the settler organizations would not raise the rent for 50 years or 30 years or 40 years or so long. And in a way, for some families, it's tempting because they don't want to be living on a continuous threat. And they say in 50 years, maybe, you know, nobody knows what happens. Hopefully will be a better situation. Others say, no, in principle, how can we really recognize that our houses belong to somebody else? So most of the families, if not all of them, rejected all of the deals and offers that the Israeli courts are doing. So most of these deals happen by agreement of both sides, because this is the only way that Israel would allow it, is through behind closed doors. So in a way, sometimes it's very difficult to keep the attention focused on Sheikh Jarrah. But Sheikh Jarrah is not unique. all over the West Bank, for many religious Zionists, they believe that it is the state of Israel is not Tel Aviv and Netanya and Herzliya or Haifa. The biblical Israel is in the West Bank. And since immediately after the occupation of 1967, they have been organizing themselves to take over as much land in Palestine, in the West Bank. And one of the ways they do it is through intimidation. They continue to attack some small communities, creating problems, trying to take hilltop by hilltop, a mountain by mountain, a field by field, in a way, and they've been succeeded. They've been very successful in as of today, they have over 500 settlements inside the West Bank, with over 1.5 million Israeli settlers moving into the West Bank. And they do it in so many different ways, through either convincing people ideologically that this land was given to us by God, or through economic incentives. And the Israeli government is very complicit. So, for example, if you're gonna start a farming business, don't do it inside Israel, do it inside the West Bank, in the Jordan Valley. And as an incentive, we give you free water, which is the major cost in our area for agriculture. Or we give you free electricity if you open a cattle farm and you produce milk and cheese and so on. Or we'll give you other benefits like tax deductions, if you're going to to build a factory and so on. And when you start a big factory with 1,000 employees, these people would bring their families and they need houses and so on. That's very systematic. And Palestinians, they feel the pressure, because not only that they are coming into and taking over their lands, of what remains in their land, how can they compete selling their vegetables and fruits if their neighbors have access to international markets, have better access to even local markets? They get they do not have the taxes or the basic costs. And even if Palestinians want to find a way creatively to make their products compete, they're not able to get water. Israel continues to deprive many of the communities in the West Bank from water, which is essential. Now, in the West Bank, although the PA is in charge of the West Bank, they're only in charge of, or have somehow of, administrative responsibilities around 12% of the West Bank. 88% of the West Bank is still under the Israeli military law. So this is part of Tobas. Yesterday or 2 days ago, they received an eviction order, and it sounds very crazy. Israel sent them these papers, and they said, according to Israeli law, according to Israeli law, 20% of the West Bank is a closed military zone, and we need to use these areas for military practice. So all of your communities, and especially in the middle of the winter season, which temperatures are very low now, you need to leave your houses, your communities, your neighborhoods for 10 days, because we're holding a military exercise. Sometimes they do, and that's very bad, because sometimes they leave military equipment, sometimes they leave unexploded devices. People are worried going to school if there's landmines psychologically and so on. It's very frustrating for our communities. And sometimes they just don't do it. You end up just forcing yourself to find a relative or a place to stay for 10 days. And incurring much costs, children losing time at school, people are not able to go to work. So it has much more implications. The reasons, I believe, and many believe, that it is just to tell people living in areas that are under Israeli control is going to be a hassle. Choose to move into areas that the PA controls, although there's limited services there too, but at least you would not face such measures. Now, it's not that it's, I'm not trying to draw a grim reality, but that's the reality. The reality is grim. However, there are signs of hope. For the first time, Israel mentioned that at Kalandia airport, which was the airport of Jerusalem, people who traveled to the Holy Land before 1967, they would have not used the airport that exists today at Ben Gurion or in Eled, in Tel Aviv. They would use the airport that is in Jerusalem. So this is like when my family relatives were traveling abroad, they would use this airport. And Israel announced a year ago that they were planning to build a settlement. And this is just like maybe 5 minutes drive from where I live, a settlement for 9,000 Jews. And for the first time, the US government called them and they said, stop this nonsense. This is not acceptable. And interestingly, Israel just canceled on Monday their plans. They did not cancel it, but they've placed it on hold. They said, we need to do an environmental study, the environmental impact of this new settlement on the environment, which is, in a way, some people might find they're using an excuse just to delay, just to find a way to convince the US government, or just trying to save face and so on. But in a way, it just shows that Israel does listen to the international community, specifically the US. When the US puts their foot down, Israel does not ignore US recommendations or advice or threats. So this is, I think maybe I spoke more than I should have, but I wasn't interrupted, which means you're very polite or was very interesting. Anyways, it's too late now to go back. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Mm-hmm. Well, it certainly wasn't that we were too polite. You were just too interesting. Yes. Thank you indeed. So would anyone like to take up Omar's call? And Doug, you have a question or comment for Omar? Mute off, please. Yeah.
Well, unmute.
Yeah.
Thank you, Omar. That was a wonderful coverage and giving us so much information that we are not aware of. And it's rather startling. It's, but we needed to know it. I'm wondering, we have known for some time that many Christians have had to leave the Holy Land. Is that exodus continuing? And to what extent are Christians continuing to leave?
So yes, I mean, there has been, well, there's around 10 million Palestinians in the world, including who live inside the historical Palestine and in the diaspora. 10% of these Palestinians are Christians. And this is reflected in many parts of the countries. For example, 9 out of every 10 Palestinians in Central and Latin America are Palestinian Christians. 50% of the Palestinians in North America are Palestinian Christians. And 40% of the Palestinians living in Europe are Palestinian Christians. So there is a very big, so 10% is a bigger percentage than what exists locally in Palestine and Israel, as which are today maybe we're less than 1% of the entire population, of the entire Palestinian population. If you look at the Palestinian Israeli population, we're 0.5% of the whole population who live in the Holy Land. Immigration started by Palestinians and specifically Palestinian Christians at the beginnings of, or at the end of the 19th century. People were fleeing poverty, persecution from the Ottoman Empire. The economic situation was terrible. There were opportunities in the global north, mainly in the US, and this is where the immigration started. So many communities immigrated or started their immigration process. Not only Palestinian Christians, but Palestinian Christians were by far the bigger percentage. And many of them immigrated. The second, loss of Palestinian Christians happened in Nakba in 1948. as I've mentioned, that it is 2/3 of the Palestinians living inside Israel, Palestinian Christians live inside Israel today, because most of the Christian community was located in the Galilee. And many of the villages were destroyed in the Galilee, so most of them became refugees like the rest of the Palestinian population. So Lebanon by itself in 1948 had over 60,000 Palestinian Christians who immigrated immediately or who became refugees in 1948. Now, because of other reasons, Palestinian Christians were the only Palestinians who were allowed to get the Lebanese citizenship. So most of them are now living in Lebanon or moved from Lebanon to other parts of the world. But that's a bigger story. I think that the immigration is not as big as people would claim. Definitely our percentages continue to fall down in Palestine and Israel, but I don't think that immigration is the leading but definitely it's not also the only factor. There is birth rate, average of birth rate. Palestinian Christians have smaller families than than Jewish or Muslim families. Palestinian Christians are not able or do not get married into the same percentage of the Muslim or the Jewish population. Most of the people get, most of the Palestinian Christians also find it easier when they immigrate to remain outside rather than just to return to live in their own communities. They could integrate much easier than other Muslim families in the West. So the numbers are not very accurate, and it needs a much more frank discussion. Most of the Palestinian Christians will say, oh, immigration. But if we look more thoroughly and dig deeper into the problems, and if we want to maintain a Palestinian Christian presence in the Holy Land, we need to address the main challenges and to work with our small community of faith and to grow. Now, the numbers are not going down because if you look at the numbers, of course, because of the population growth, in 1910, the number of Palestinian Christians were around 50,000. At that time, we were like 15 or 17% of the population. Today, we are 200,000 Palestinian Christians. However, we're 1% of the population. So Israel has also using Aliyah, bringing Jews from all around the world, from the diaspora, back into Israel also affects percentage-wise and so on. So there's so many factors. It's more complicated than just what's saying immigration.
Thank you.
Thank you. Say another 2 questions before we finish. Ray?
Yes, yes. Thanks, Omar, for that great talk. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Omar, and for that wonderful talk with so much information, and salam to you and to everyone. Now, Omar, you're just talking about the decreasing Palestinian Christian presence. So that is decreasing. How does that impact on Palestinian justice? And if that was slowed, or if there was an increase in Palestinian Christian presence, how would that impact on Palestinian justice for Palestinians? Thank you.
30 years ago, when you spoke about Palestine and Israel, it was a conflict. It was a conflict that people would say it's similar. It was either colonial. It depends on who was talking about it, but it would have been Israelis and Arabs, or it was a colonial and indigenous people, or whatever people would use terminology. They wouldn't use the religious terminology in describing the conflict. In the last 30 years, or maybe 35 years, this has been changing very much. So it's for most people within what's happening with Islamophobia, with the growth of religious extremism, people feel that this is Israel, Jews are fighting Muslims. That is, I mean, it has, or Christians who love Israel or who love the Jews, or Christians who love Jesus are working to help the Jews to maintain their presence until Jesus comes back, or whatever language. people use to describe the conflict, they're forcing religion into the conflict. Now, we Palestinian Christians are the ingredient that ruins most of these discussions. When Christian Zionists come here, or Christian extremists, they're fine with the idea of supporting Jews or Israelis to fight or to attack or to do whatever they want to do, or to take over the land and the property of Muslims. But when you say, I'm a Palestinian Christian and I'm suffering, it really shakens the foundations of the. Now, it's not right, I know, it's not ethical, but it is also, people should care for everybody who is suffering, regardless of who they are or whoever is doing or regardless of who's doing the injustice. But we're all biased in one way or another, and that's a reason. Also for the Muslims, because we're creating, like on Saturday, Sabeel is holding in partnership with others, a conference. The Muslim community today, the Palestinian Muslim community, or a big percentage of it, completely ignores the Holy Land or the history of the land, or the remaining population of the Holy Land who are not Muslim. And this is reflecting through curriculum textbooks, through speeches of politicians and so on. So we're holding a conference to encourage the community to just say, stop. The Palestinian community is much bigger than one group of faith and so on. And our struggle is a struggle for human rights, for justice. It's regardless. We could be, if it was we were occupying a piece of land, I don't think that this would make any of us different, that we need to stand with the people who are oppressed, regardless who is oppressing them. And this is very much reflected when we oppose US policies or European policies or even Australian policies. And this might be your government or people that or the majority of the people in your country reflect the same or adhere to the same religion or values that, or claim to do, that you do. And that is, so we are the secret ingredient that is rocking the boat. And this is why we feel lots of people who value our input as Palestinian Christians, specifically from secular groups, justice groups, whether they are in other Palestinian groups or Israeli groups or international groups, because they see the potential and the importance of what we offer to this conversation. We're just telling the people, you're having the wrong conversation. And we're having Christian brothers and sisters who use theology or the Bible to justify the injustice that is happening in our country.
Thank you. Now, is there a final question?
Yeah, I would like to ask a question.
Kevin?
Omar, thank you for your description of the current situation, which is not a pretty one. We're in Australia, we're a very long way away from Palestine and Israel, but we do what we can to support advocacy for peace and justice. When we talk to our own government in Australia, they tell us that they support peace also. They're looking for a two-state solution, and that one of the big problems is terrorism from Hamas. What does Sabeel Jerusalem have to say about these things?
I mean, part of it is that I have to admit, I've never met anybody in the world who does not love peace. Everybody. So, I mean, it is your government fits to everybody else around the world. Now, we always hear these, it is, if people, it's very simple, even though sometimes they start, as politicians, they throw this argument here and there. In principle, if we believe in international law, and that's why we support the two-state solution, we need to make sure that all parties respect this, respect international law and implement the resolutions, regardless who are the Palestinians, who are the Israelis, and so on. So that's a big part. You don't need to really believe you don't need to really respect the Australian government or the Prime Minister or your governor to obey the traffic laws in Australia. And that's the same thing when it comes to the international community. It is as basic as if we implement international law or not. Now they say Hamas is a problem. Yeah, many people, I would also say that Hamas might be a problem. But the occupation started before Hamas came to existence. You know, it is Hamas came to existence in 1989. They really didn't gain power until 2002 or 3. I mean, or gain a big percentage of supporters. So Hamas is new. The occupation is much older. Zionism is much older. So it is, of course, you cannot control. We can wish and we can work that people react to nonviolence, using only nonviolence or abiding with certain laws, but we don't have the power to go into everybody's heart and everybody's mind and to really alter how they want to react when their house gets demolished or when their children get shot or when their father gets arrested or their mother gets arrested. People react in different ways. And part of it is that we need to accept the excuse for everybody to either pick up the arms and fight or to use violence is the occupation. If we, and that the lack of the international community response or will to hold Israel accountable when it comes to UN resolutions, that is, that's where the problem lies. Because we become living somehow in the Wild West, if I might use this terminology, where you need to pick up your own gun and fight your way to succeed. And we hoped as humanity that after World War II, we are beyond this stage. We have developed as species that we really need to find values and ethics that we all accepted and signed agreements. And this is the way how we solve conflicts. And to a certain extent, we have been successful, not everywhere, knowing that the US government has vetoed most over 47 laws or resolutions that are asking Israel by the international community to be held accountable. The same thing with France and the UK in addition. The US continues to give Israel the impunity to act as they are, which is something that is not healthy and it's not good.
For anyone, that's why in PIEN, the Palestine Israel Ecumenical Network, our vision of peace with justice is for all. Omar, thank you for your wisdom, your experiences, and your words from the Holy Land, your detail. On behalf of everyone, thank you indeed. So good night, everyone. Fred's already waving good night there. Oh, is that a clap? Oh, I thought it would be hint. Okay. Well, good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Wonderful to join with you all and with Omar, and go in peace. See,
in the name of Christ.
Omar, good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye.
Thanks, Omar. Bye.
Well, thanks.
Thanks, Omar.